A couple people had asked me about the domain and range questions and set notation when something has a domain or a range of all real numbers. So I just wanted to walk you guys through a couple of quick examples. So this is a pretty basic graph of obviously a linear function. Its domain, its x values from left to right would be all real numbers or negative infinity to positive infinity. And then again, if we're talking about the range, we're talking the y values. So from the bottom to the top. We would also say that the range would be all real numbers or negative infinity to positive infinity. So how do we write that in set notation? So set notation is actually pretty easy when you're working with a domain or a range of all real numbers. What actually ends up happening is you would just write it as x, such that x is an element of the real numbers. Since there are no restrictions on the x values, that's why we don't have to worry about the inequality here. And the range would be pretty similar, except besides the fact that you'd be using a y instead of an x. So we just write that as y, such that y is an element of the real numbers. Just some notation to go over with you for something that looks like this. Obviously, that looks like a pretty similar graph, except there's a hole in it. So for its domain, we would say that it's all real numbers except for the x value of 1. So we could write this one of two ways. In interval notation, that would be negative infinity, comma 1. And since that is an open circle, we'd want to use the parentheses here. And since there is a break in the graph, this is where we'd want to use the union. And then we would start again at 1 and then continue on to positive infinity. Again, we're not including the 1 here because, again, it's still open. The range would also actually be exactly the same thing. If we read it from the bottom to the top, from the bottom, we're stopping at the y value of 1, and we're skipping over it, and then we're continuing on until infinity. So the range would be written exactly the same way. So in set notation, instead of like breaking this up into being two different inequalities, we can actually simplify our process by saying its domain would be x, such that x is an element of the real numbers. And then what we could do is we could just say that since the domain is basically everything but this one x value, we can just say that x can't be equal to 1 and call that a day. We could potentially split this up into two different inequalities if we wanted to, but that ends up getting a little bit messy and cumbersome here. So this is the kind of the simplified way to write that. And the range we could write the exact same way, obviously, except we'd be using the y's instead of the x's. So we would say that y can't be equal to 1. So that basically is telling us that the range could be everything except for 1. The domain could be anything except for 1. Hope that helps. Let me know if you have any other questions.